And this also kept him from rating higher than he did. He got up Medicare, which is on the books, but he couldn't get it passed. He got up federal aid to education, but he couldn't get it passed. And he got up the Civil Rights Act, but he couldn't get it passed. And again, the problem was, he needed the man whom he wouldn't use. He needed Lyndon Johnson.
That's correct.
But he didn't, he and Johnson hated each other. But he needed Johnson because Johnson was such a vote getter, and Johnson got millions of votes pulled in. But otherwise, once in office, and people noticed, you never heard from the vice president anymore. Now, when Eisenhower was in office, you heard Vice President Nixon did this, Vice President Nixon that. Kennedy got in office, and Johnson, I mean, my 8th grade teacher, you don't hear about the vice president. Even the Beetle Bailey
Don't hear
comics
about the vice president.
said, where the Plato said, we don't hear about the vice president anymore. He was kept in the background and kept real quiet.
So, but till today, you don't hear about the vice president. Why is that?
Well, no, okay, you might be right, but
I
we
never
hear
heard anything about, Biden or anything
perhaps
about,
so, perhaps so,
Pence,
yeah.
really.
But in Eisenhower's day, we heard a lot about Nixon, with all respect.
Right.
And then came Kennedy, but now Johnson was kept quieter even in.
So officially, what does the vice president do today, or is it just a title?
No, in the Congress, one act, it's this the Constitution. He presides over the Senate. Now, he could become important, here's why. He only votes if there's a tie. So if the vote to confirm a justice is 49 to 49, he'd vote.
So that's pretty much his job.
That's his job. He presides over the Senate. No, he keeps order.
He keeps order in the Senate. That's
Yeah.
pretty much what he does.
Pretty much what he does, and that's all. Otherwise, he's sitting on the sidelines waiting.
To do things.
Waiting for the president to either become too sick to
Do anything, yeah.
to operate, or waiting for the president to die. Hey, when Reagan was shot, the vice president was out on a big trip, and they hurriedly got on the phone and said, hey, turn the plane around and come back to where you're needed in Washington right now. And Vice President Bush came back to Washington. Ronald Reagan was shot. And nobody knew what his condition would be when he came out of surgery. Not even the doctors knew. He recovered, of course. All right, anyway, he would not use Johnson knew his way around the Congress. Kennedy didn't. Now, there's another aspect to this, too, and that's Kennedy's, I must admit, Kennedy's womanizing. We did not know anything about this vote until 4 years after 1967. And yet they say that everybody in Washington knew, all the senators knew, the press knew, but they wouldn't publish it. Now, that's not true of the press today. But everybody in Washington knew, but outside nobody knew that he was a womanizer. I don't want to go into much detail, but there's one woman though I want to mention, and that is Ellen Romsch. I don't know, I won't write her name down. Ellen Romsch, I believe, is still alive. Here's the bad thing about Ellen Romsch. Okay, now the Secret Service reported that if you know Jackie's not in the bed with him, and you see a pretty girl heading for his office, you're to let her through. Well, this was upset because the Secret Service thought, well, what if she kills him? How are we going to explain that to the country? And then the other thing is, what if she's a spy? Ellen Romsch is believed to have been an East German spy. Now, if she was, this was high treason, of course, on the part of JFK. What finally happened to Ellen Romsch? Robert Kennedy, who was doing everything he could to cover up for his brother, one day gave Ellen Romsch a one-way plane ticket back to East Germany, and Ellen Romsch knew if she didn't take that ticket, she was going to have an accident. This is the way the Kennedy boys operated. Ellen Romsch took the plane ticket and never heard from her again. But was she an East German spy? Well, it looks like she was. And if she was, what did she find out from JFK that might have hurt the country? We may never know. But this went on while Kennedy was president. Now, before you think that I'm thinking Kennedy was an outright louse, there was one thing he did that was right. And that one thing made up for all of his bad. It's what he saved the world from nuclear annihilation. There was a Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's right. Johnson.
As far as I'm concerned, what I've read, the Cuban Missile Crisis was entirely the Soviet Union's fault. They put missiles in Cuba, or started to. We caught them. A U-2 pilot reported that he saw a missile and he photographed them in Cuba. We looked again, and yes, they were there. Kennedy said they must go. It looked like a war was about to take place.
They were going to shoot them at the States, right?
What's that?
Were they going to shoot them at the States?
Well, we don't know what would happen. Nobody knows. Nixon said if I had been president, I would have invaded Cuba. But I want to say this in Kennedy's behalf. He decided to negotiate one more time with the Russians. The Russians agreed to pull their missiles out of Cuba. Okay, but what we did not know, and your book mentions this, we found out years later, we agreed to pull our missiles out of Turkey. Now, I had a pupil tell me, I think that we American people should know about these things. Oh, get real. Well, wake up to the real world. In the real world, these leaders make secret treaties
And nobody knows
that
about
we don't know about. Yeah, and folks, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, it's just the way it's done. Anyway, Kennedy made this secret treaty with the Russians that we would pull our missiles out of Turkey, and they pulled their missiles out of Cuba, and a crisis was averted. To me, this was Kennedy's finest hour. It's somewhat made up for the Bay of Pigs. Now, we come to part of the story about the Kennedy assassination. Folk, there have been at least 200 books written on the topic. Yes.
I spoke to a man who was personal friends with the leader of the KGB, and he told me that Russia had zero to do with his assassination, that it was actually an oil company based out of Texas that had to do with the Kennedy assassination, who hired someone to kill Kennedy. And this was the leader of the
oil
KGB
company-
at the time. Who
Okay, now
went
I in no way am I going to. The oil company was headed up by George Herbert Walker Bush. Now here's the story. Now you all know hopefully that there were some papers that were the last of the
Essentially, it
papers
was
were to
an
be
inside
released. George Herbert Walker Bush was president, ordered the paper released 25 years from now. He thought he'd be dead. Now, all right, 25 years ended in October 2017. And guess what? George Herbert Walker Bush was still alive. Now, Donald Trump, and he's a man who tries more than any president to keep his word. He said, I'm going to release the files. But I believe if I had been president, and I know what I think I know now, I would not release the video.
The point is, it wasn't Russia, and the babushka lady was just some random
It
lady.
wasn't Russia.
Right,
But
but
what
everyone
we
thought it
did-
was.
Yeah. But see, what they did release, and folks, now listen to, they did release that we tried to bump off Castro and name the person in the event. Now, if they released that, then what are they? That's an act of war.
Yeah.
That's war. And of course, it happened more than 50 years ago. So they won't go to war with us over that now.
Statute of limitations that
But
ends after 30
it
years.
was, yeah, but that's an act of war. So if they release that, what are they still keeping? They hinted that some people are still alive who were involved, namely the Texas oil man, George Herbert Walker
It's
Bush.
basically,
Right.
he hired someone out of, yeah,
Now, as far as Lee Harvey Oswald, you all know
he hired Lee Harvey
Lee
Oswald.
Harvey Oswald could not find a job, but he was at the Texas Book Depository. How convenient! He worked there. Now, how convenient can you get? In other words, he was placed there, folk. When he did not find that job, the job was given to him,
Job was given to him so that he can pull
so that
off
he could.
the job.
Now, we're talking where we don't quite know, but he worked there. And why did he work? Because he couldn't find a job. He was put there. I mean, I'm repeating myself.
No, I know.
This is, and then the motorcade was at the last minute ordered to go under that textbook depository. I've heard about Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson. This story has been told. The original plan was for the motorcade to not go that route, and then Johnson turned it at the last minute, where it would go right under the Texas School Book Depository. Textbook depository. Inside job. Now, all right, here's the other side of it now. I've heard this one time and I can't verify it. But supposedly, all right, this I have heard. When John Kennedy was shot, his brother Robert was in the Senate. Now, he was not a senator, but he was in the Senate. the Senate was conducting a super secret closed door meeting. And only an national emergency could, well, the national emergency when the president was shot in the back of the head. That was that's when they opened the door and said, hey, the president's been shot. And that's when Robert got on the phone, he was told there's been an accident. Your brother's been shot. But what were they discussing behind this they were discussing John Kennedy's affair with Ellen Romsch, which was grounds for impeachment.
So they were going to impeach him too.
Who?
Kennedy.
John Kennedy. They were, yeah. Well, but here's, let me tell you though, now this story is verifiable. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI, had all this knowledge, and he said to John Kennedy, I mean, basically he's made the deal with, see, J. Edgar Hoover was afraid every time a new president came that the new president was going to fire him. So when Kennedy was elected, J. Edgar Hoover got up a deal with him and said, listen, I know dirt on 40 senators, and if you'll promise to let me stay in office, I will talk to these 40 senators and I'll keep them off your back. So basically, the senators didn't know what to do. You know, if they opened up about Ellen Romsch, J. Edgar Hoover was going to open up about them.
So Hoover kept them from
Hoover kind of kept them up. Now, but again, what would have happened if Kennedy happened? Nobody knows.
Why did Hoover want to keep Kennedy in office?
Because Kennedy was keeping him in office. Hoover.
So, because Kennedy was
In other
keeping him in office, so it's basically
Yeah, in other
I'll
words,
keep
listen,
them off your back.
I'll
you
keep them off your back
my
if you'll keep them.
Off
I mean,
my
I'll
back.
keep them off your back if you'll keep me in my
Me
job.
in office, yeah.
So Hoover remained in office till the day he died. There have been several movies made about Hoover, and my wife said he looked like a bulldog, which he really did. You know, if you've ever seen a
A
picture.
French bulldog, yeah.
Yeah. Hoover, I mean, he was a half a nutcase.
Hoover was president.
Hoover, this was a different Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover was director of the FBI.
Yeah, J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah. The other Hoover was president, yes. But this J. Edgar Hoover was director, long-time director of the FBI.
His
Anyway,
name is on
but-
their building in Washington, the Hoover building.
Yeah.
Is where the FBI is located.
Yeah, because he was the first director, and he's such a long-term director. And he managed to hold on to office in spite of some sleazy dealings and a whole lot of stuff that's...
Screwball.
Anyway, yeah. I won't go into a lot of detail. Basically, he was accused of being a cross-dresser, Hoover, J. Hoover, accused of being a cross-dresser, which you can't quite prove it. And he was accused, now this he did do. He would take credit for arresting men that actually one of his agents had arrested. This he did on more than one occasion.
He made a big name for himself.
He was trying to build himself up. All right, anyway, now, about the assassination of Kennedy, again, there have been books written, and I still think there's a lot that's not been told because they're still keeping a lot of files. And if you actually read accounts, there are persons who were not interviewed who should have been. There are persons who were coerced to testify one way when they really want to testify another. There are a lot of people believe that there was another shooter that he is killed by the front of him on a grassy knoll. His head does jerk backward, and it's a prudent film. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Anyway.
So you could have had a reaction.
Well, also, some people were saying if you're hitting the back of the head, your head will initially go forward about an inch or two, but then when the bullet exits, the exit will knock your head back.
It would.
Okay, well then in that case, he was shot in the back of the head.
He was shot in the back of the head.
Yeah, okay. But some people tried to say he was shot from the
Even if you
grassy
look
knoll.
at the actual entry point of the bullet, you can actually tell when you look at a bullet hole where the bullet came out based on trajectory, not trajectory, but based on the way the wound looks and where it went in. It's
Yeah, you
I've seen it
can,
myself. It's
Again, here's the problem with Kennedy's body. Only admirals looked at it, and none of them had any experience at all at being a coroner. The real coroner were not allowed to look at his body. Okay, I've got to move on. So I spent a lot. All right, anyway, Johnson took over, and immediately Johnson got all this legislation passed. He got Medicare passed, which is still in the books, is probably bankrupt. He got the Civil Rights Act passed. He got federal aid to education. And I want to say this, folks, about education. They tried to tell us that federal aid would not be followed up by federal control. No, it is. Education in this country has gotten worse and worse and worse and worse and worse
What,
since the
27?
federal government took over.
We're 27th federal in education.
What's that?
We're ranking in the world 27 or something, or in the 30?
Out of the worst of the what's supposedly advanced nations, the absolute worst. And having been a teacher myself, I can tell you a lot of the teachers cannot keep any kind of order in school. I don't know what you think about it, but that's just my take on it. The teachers get no respect, and my wife bumped into a janitor at one of the malls, shopping malls, a few weeks back. This janitor said, I once was a public school teacher, but I would rather sweep floors and mop floors here than be a teacher, because I get more respect here than everybody as a teacher. Teachers get disrespect from kids, from parents, from principals, everybody like that.
It used to be that when a kid came home with an F, it would be the kid's fault. Today, it's the teacher's fault.
We did not tell our parents we got a pattern in school. My brother did. He had them wait for when we got home. Oh, yes. Yes, he did. But my other brother, Richard, he wouldn't tell our dad, because he'd had another one waiting for when we got home. In my dad's case, he got a lot of patterns when he was in school. And he had another one waiting for him when he got home. But he actually had to switch. Not the paddles. So the teachers used paddles. His aunt, my dad was really right aunt, used the switch. He had another one waiting for him when he got home. But today, it's all the teacher's fault. And the teachers can't teach. And I don't know if the situation will ever get better. I think the solution is to go back to one-room schoolhouses where they have one teacher, no principals, and the teacher then has all the authority, and the teacher can decide who comes in and who doesn't. That's the way the education system used to be, and everybody then knows everybody. Hey, they found out that South Dakota was rating really high on achievement. And, hey, we got to find out what's so great about South Dakota schools. They went into South and investigated. They found the teachers there were, some of them were good and most of them were average or poor. They found out that in South Dakota, the money spent in education was less than it was in most states. The buildings were more dilapidated. Well, what was so great about South Dakota's education? Hey, the schools were small and all the kids knew each other. Everybody knew everybody on the football team. Everyone knew the cheerleaders. It worked. Everyone knew everybody in the community. Everybody knew everybody else's little brother and little sister. Everybody knew everybody. It was a small school, and this must be. And see, in the meantime, they've been working to build a big consolidated school. How much better your football team will be if you have 3,000 people to pick from. But guess what? Your average boy can't make the team. Where 250 boys will try for the basketball team, 15 make it. Whereas in a small school, every boy who tried out made the team. And most of them got to play. Now some of your more marginal players might not get to play a lot. Might get jump playing time, but everybody who tried out made the team. Football team, every boy who tried out made it. The teams might not have been as good, but hey, you know, but anyway. So this was something I heard years ago, why South Dakota schools were so great. All right, let's see, where am I located? Now, Johnson, okay, in 1964, Johnson had to face re-election. I got 15 minutes. And Johnson ran against Barry Goldwater, and how well, I was 15 years old. Johnson won overwhelmingly. But, just like Nixon's overwhelming victory in 1972, Johnson's overwhelming victory in 1964 turned quickly to ashes, because Johnson ran on a platform of, I will keep us out of Vietnam, when all the time it's called the credibility gap, and all he was actually planning to get more involved once he got elected. My mother said Johnson would show his true colors after he said Johnson got elected, and immediately he escalated the war in Vietnam. But it proved to be a very unpopular move. And at this point, the students got upset, and students began rioting on campuses and in the streets. The riots occurred, and of course, race riots. Race riots became a big thing especially after Martin Luther King was killed in 1968. There were big riots in the streets. Riots occurred in Detroit, and in other words, just all over the place. Eventually the rioting died down, but as the blacks, not just in the South, all over. Now I'll tell you this, the rioting started in the South, but it hit the northern cities harder than it ever hit the southern cities. Because the North was actually more, the North was more discriminatory than the South. Number one. Number two, the North was more hypocritical about it than the South. I mean, a man who would openly tell you that I'm prejudiced. Well, you know which side he's on. But when a man says, I'm not prejudiced, when he really is, you wind up hating him. You follow my logic. If a man says, I am prejudiced, okay, we know that. Yeah, we can respect you for that. Okay, you are.
You don't.
But when you say, I'm not prejudiced, but we all know you are, that's a bad man there. That's a really bad man. And the North was, I'm not prejudiced, but they really were by their actions. The South, oh, we knew they were.
The enemy you don't know.
That's it.
Essentially.
Now, eventually what happened, more northern people like myself, moved to the South. And the southern politicians had to change their ways. Governor Wallace of Alabama made amends to the blacks. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina made his amends to the blacks. And eventually southern politicians realized they had to go after black voters in order to be elected. And the blacks were given the right to vote, and they started registering in droves. They had a registration drive encouraging blacks to come out in droves, and the Ku Klux Klan was powerless to stop it. No longer could they intimidate, because it was done now in front of the whole nation with the cameras and the spotlights going, and armed guards protecting them. And
You don't have the armed guards anymore.
Just recently, I mean, it appears that black women's vote kept more and more from Alabama going to the Senate. This story is told anyway. You can view it. The black women were overwhelmingly against Roy Moore, and that was especially true after he was accused of harassment. All right, I'll leave that unless somebody else wants to discuss it. Anyway, race riots occurred, student protest riots occurred. All this. Oh yeah, the 1960s are looked on as a time of prosperity. We call it the affluent society. The word affluent means rich. The rich society, America had the richest society in the world. I wonder how much longer it'll last. But anyway, the United States was a rich country. And Lyndon Johnson believed, he learned from the Depression, he believed if you could keep people fed, they'd be happy. He gave people jobs, gave people money, threw out a whole lot of socialistic legislation, and the people were miserable. If you want to check up and read it, then later it was found that Lyndon Johnson had stolen some elections back in the late 1940s when he was first running for Senate. His first election he ran, it was stolen from him. So he learned a thing or two, and he got to make sure that he stole the next election. This story, again, you can find this out if you verify it. If you look it up. Johnson became extremely unpopular. In the meantime, Richard Nixon ran for governor of California in 1962 and lost. Richard Nixon told the press, whom he hated, he said, "You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore." And in a sorrowful way, he turned and walked into oblivion. And he believed his the press said, it looks like Richard Nixon's political career is over. He's dead. In 1968, Richard Nixon re-entered the race, ran for president again. And this time he got the nomination of his party. And this time he was elected. Like Eisenhower before, Richard Nixon said, if elected, I will go to Vietnam. He went to Vietnam. Now, under Nixon, several things went on. Number one, the Vietnam War ended.
In 68?
Not in 68. in 1973. The Vietnam War ended. Also, he opened up trade with China,
In 73.
That was done in 1971. Now, I was in graduate school at the time. But he opened up trade with China. See, I was in graduate school when I was taking medieval European history, and my teacher's name was Ketches.
What year did the Vietnam War end?
Anyway, China trade was opened up. Vietnam War ended in January 1973. China was opened up. Nixon had a lot of successes abroad. At home, he did not remain very popular. He never did develop a good rapport with the press, maybe because, well, I tell you, if you're a Republican, you can't get along with the press. So why try? Hey, you being a teacher, you shouldn't say that. Well, I said it. That's out. But anyway, he never did like the press. His daughter married Eisenhower's grandson. Early in his administration, Eisenhower died. Nixon delivered a eulogy. The first trip to the moon occurred while Nixon was president, and Nixon got on the telephone. They showed him on the telephone in the White House. And he called Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon and asked them to, will you please stand in front of the camera? So the two men, they had to hop, they drifted along towards the front of the camera. They stood in the camera, and Richard Nixon made a very impressive speech, about how that we have done what people once thought impossible. Moon, yeah, but that occurred during Nixon's administration. Nixon really, all right, he came to the 1972 election, which he thought he was going to lose. He believed he was behind and thought for sure, see, he had an easy time of it because Vietnam had made the Democrats unpopular, but Vietnam was kind of history, and he was afraid of losing. So he began to rig the election in such a way that the Democrats would pick a candidate that was easy to beat. So the leading Democrats, he began to tell a horror story. It's called Operation Dirty Tricks. Operation Dirty Tricks. Now, to give an example, he told that Muskie's wife had been unfaithful. Well, Muskie got up and Muskie was, my wife has never done anything like that. Well, those tears cost Muskie the nomination. He thought the president should be more presidential. Muskie was out. Then he told that the next candidate, Hubert Humphrey, was homosexual. He wasn't. In short order, Muskie was on his way out too. He got the man to run against him was George McGovern. McGovern was one of the least intelligent men who ever run for president. And McGovern's campaign went to pieces right from the start. Again, the idea was to get a candidate there to destroy the reputation of all the leading candidates, to get one that they could easily beat. But just about the time the election was getting good and started, in June of 1972, there was this black man who had never had success in much of anything. This black man finally got him a job at the Watergate Hotel, Watergate, and his job was to be a security guard. Well, he noticed that on the Democratic headquarters, the Democratic had its headquarters there at Watergate. Then on the Democratic headquarters rooms, that wing, there was some electrical tape on the door. He thought, some of these custodians were done, so he took the electrical tape away. Didn't call the cops, right? He took the electrical tape away. Now, of course, security guards do not keep the same pattern night after night, or even during the same shift. He eventually came back to the same door and noticed there's tape on it. Well, wait a minute, I removed that tape. I got a pocket, I removed it. So he called the cops at that point. Now, G. Gordon Liddy was inside. And G. Gordon Liddy said the dumbest thing ever did was put tape back on the door after that security guard removed it. G. Gordon Liddy had seen the tape removed. The purpose of the tape was to defeat the lock so that they could get in and out. In case you're wondering what the tape was for. It was to defeat the lock. Anyway, the Washington police were so busy that night that they couldn't send a real policeman, so they sent two plainclothes detectives in an unmarked car. Now, in the meantime, there were guards looking out. As they saw any police, they were supposed to clear out of them. I mean, the break-in people were supposed to clear out. So anyway, these two detectives went to Watergate Hotel, saw the tape. They flipped the door open, hooked out their service revolvers, which they held into the suit boots. In those days, everybody in Washington wore suits. Hooked out their These servers involved and said, all right, come out from behind there with your hands up. They expected 2 hands to come up. Instead, 10 hands went up. And the men were the men who owned the hands, you might say, were wearing suits and ties, like the people in Washington did. And they were busy, not stealing, they were busy planting wiretaps and microphones and tape recorders and listening devices inside McGovern's headquarters.
So illegal.
It was illegal, clearly illegal. Now, folks, I want to say this.